Yep. Right, horsepower. How much horsepower does a motorcycle need to be thoroughly practical in all road conditions? Now, don't worry, I'm going to change this video clip in a few moments. I'm just sort of playing it to make a point, really. First of all, no, I wasn't the rider of this. This is some footage that was sent through on press launch. Yeah, I've got to admit, I'm not impressed by the standard of the riding in this particular video. I got a lot of complaints about it. I did think twice about uploading it week before last, was it last week? But it's often really frustrating when you get these press packs through. Often they don't send you an awful lot of footage and you end up sort of reusing it several times in the video. There was a wealth of it in this particular press pack. And, when you get these initial launches where you can't get access to the bike, you're just inundated with complaints from people, oh, we can't hear the engine. So I uploaded this just to please those people. I sort of wish I didn't now, but yes, I fully agree with all those that complained. The standard of riding in this video is appalling. The rider obviously wasn't hired for his skill, and although I'm not up on Spanish road traffic regulations, I assume they're very similar to what we have here in England. Yes, there were a lot of offences committed in that video, but that's part of the point that I want to make with this video. We see this sort of riding all the time. Someone with more enthusiasm than skill and common sense and a regard for other road users. Riders that we see every single day that mistake skill for sheer luck. And very often that luck runs out eventually. Just take, for example, this Monday just gone, myself and Paula, we needed to go to do some shopping. We decided to go to the local Asda, which is about 4 or 5 miles away. Nice little ride, hot sunny afternoon through the countryside. We did our shopping. Loaded the panniers up with around 20 kilograms or 3 or 4 days worth of shopping, and then we started the journey home. Now, just as you come out of Asda, you have to negotiate a mini roundabout to get back onto the main road, and then a couple of 100 yards down the main road, which is a 30-mile-an-hour limit, there's another mini roundabout with a turn off to the left, and then the road hooks slightly to the right. You're actually going straight on, but it hooks slightly to the right before it continues straight on. Now, as I was approaching the second mini roundabout, a bike appeared from nowhere behind me, overtook me about, well in excess of 40 miles an hour. I might be wrong, but I got the impression in my head it was a Suzuki, some big fat-assed sports tourer. But in his egotistical need to overtake me, he misjudged the distance from the mini roundabout. Now, this bike had great big Cruiser style or suitcase style plastic panniers on it. Part of the roundabout itself is surrounded by pedestrian guardrails. Luckily, he didn't come off, but the end result was that the lid of his left-hand pannier was sort of left in pieces on the road because it hit the guardrail. And although I was travelling at the correct sort of speed to negotiate that mini roundabout, it then caused me a problem, and I had to change my line mid-manoeuvre to avoid those bits of plastic which could have caused an accident on my part if I'd run over them. I didn't stop because I just don't have time for people like that. He pulled into the side of the road, obviously, to go and see what was left of his luggage. And as I continued my journey home, I just thought to myself, his egotistical need to show his superiority to me, put me in danger. It undoubtedly cost him, at least £300, I would have thought, for a new pannier. And at the end of the day, it was a completely failed lesson on his part, because all he really showed is that he's got no skill as a rider and he can't handle his bike. But the sad fact is, we see this style of riding all the time, and I honestly think it's worse now than it's ever been. Which brings us on to this misunderstood and misguided obsession with horsepower. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the figures I'm going to give you here are impeccably correct. They're around about right. I'm not going to lead you astray with them. And I'm just saying that for the benefit of those trolls that will spend 2.5 hours researching one sentence that I've said and then come back and tell me that the entire video is wrong because, you know, I was 0.3 out on that particular statistic. First of all, what is 1 horsepower? Well, there's mechanical horsepower, there's brake horsepower. This sort of goes back to the days of watermills, where watermills would be erected at factories to provide power to power machinery, for grinding flour or powering textile looms. And it was calculated by the ability of a horse to lift a specified weight on a pulley to a predetermined height. Now, first of all, horses come in all different shapes and sizes. You know, are we talking about a miniature pony? Or are we talking a great big Shire horse? Actually, I don't know. Now, I seem to remember reading way back in the dim and distant past that actually 1 mechanical horsepower is only the equivalent of about 1/7 of the total power something like a heavy horse can output. So if you have a 100 horsepower motorcycle or car and you think you've got the equivalent of 100 horses under your bonnet, you're mistaken. You've got nowhere near that. But then the marketing departments of various motoring manufacturers saw a chance to inflate things slightly. For a start, horsepower wasn't regarded as universal, so we had the German PS measurement, which is an abbreviation of a German word I can't pronounce, so I'm not even going to attempt it. Now, PS and horsepower are almost interchangeable, but not quite. So, if you had a high horsepower engine and you used PS, you could inflate the numbers very slightly. And so it became fashionable in about the 1990s, especially for motorcycle manufacturers, to start quoting PS figures. And nowadays, of course, the power output tends to be quoted in kilowatts, which is, I think it's 1.37 kilowatts to 1 horsepower, which allows you to inflate the numbers even more. Your average punter doesn't know the difference between a kilowatt and a mechanical horsepower or a brake horsepower or PS, and they tend to regard them as being completely interchangeable, but they're not. So without telling any lies, the marketing department of a motorcycle company can give the impression that the engine actually pumps out a lot more horsepower than it actually does. And by and large, horsepower is all anyone ever talks about nowadays, especially when they're reviewing motorcycles. And, you know, I tend to review modestly powered motorcycles, and I do that for a reason, because really 50 brake horsepower is the maximum you actually need for all eventualities on the road, and I don't care what country you live in. Because horsepower is just one big trick. It's a con. And it all stems from the Japanese manufacturers back in the 1970s and 80s battling it out, playing a game of top trumps to grab the most customers by having 1 or 2 horsepower more than their rival. Because unfortunately, that's the way a biker's mind works. But then you start to encounter 1 or 2 problems. Once you get over 100 horsepower, the motorcycle becomes, to all intents and purposes, unmanageable. That's if you're able to use that power, which I would argue you can't. There's no way you can use all that power on a motorcycle, no matter how good you think you are. Now, when you look at the higher powered motorcycles today, most of them have a thing called traction control fitted. I don't think it's mandatory yet, like ABS is, but I think that'll come one day. And they introduced traction control for a reason. Now, these companies have talked people into buying their motorcycles because they're 100 brake horsepower, 150 or even 200 brake horsepower. But if they supplied a vehicle to those customers that was actually capable of producing that, they would all kill themselves, or most of them would. So these motorcycle manufacturers and some car manufacturers introduced traction control, which effectively, for the most part, halves the amount of horsepower available to you. So you've paid a premium for a high horsepower bike, and then on top of that you pay for a device which takes half of that power away from you. Yes, they are laughing all the way to the bank. So for those of you who say that, you know, anything below 100 horsepower or even 70 horsepower, 60 horsepower for that matter, is no good for the roads they ride on, the joke is on you. Because if the motorcycle you've bought has traction control fitted, you are never going to get access to the supposed horsepower that engine is supposedly able to produce. Now, let's look at this from another angle. The early land speed records were set and broken by motorcycles because they had the best power to weight ratios. By today's standards, the horsepower output of those motorcycles was quite modest. What was important was getting up to that maximum speed ready for the the actual time measurements to be taken, because once you get up to terminal velocity, only a fraction of the horsepower that engine produces is required to hold it at that speed. On the flat, horsepower really only becomes relevant when it comes down to acceleration. In 1948, a Vincent Black Shadow took the world speed record at 150 miles an hour with only 70 brake horsepower. And the latest land speed record of, I think it's 763 miles per hour in 1997 was achieved with a vehicle that had 102,000 horsepower. So obviously, the more horsepower you have, it becomes an exercise in diminishing returns. In order to achieve 5 times that original land speed record required 1,400 times more horsepower. So realistically, if you're comparing a 50 brake horsepower motorcycle with a 100 brake horsepower motorcycle, it's not going to give you twice the performance. In both cases, you're not going to require the full extent of the horsepower theoretically available to get you up to road legal speeds. It's all just a big con. If you want a fast, fun, powerful motorcycle, if that's the way your mind works, if you absolutely must have that, 50 brake horsepower is the maximum you need for road legal speeds anywhere in the world. In fact, I would argue that 30 brake horsepower is perfectly adequate for any road you would care to ride on. Because once you get above that, not only is the bike probably not going to allow you to use it, in all likelihood, you're never going to be able to use it. I'll just draw your attention to a particular motorcycle publication that actually did a test a few years back. They took 4 motorcycles from different manufacturers, different CCs, but they were all capable, in theory, of producing around about 100 horsepower. Each machine was fitted with sort of specialist electronics which recorded the horsepower used during the course of the ride. It gave a minute-to-minute, blow-by-blow record of everything that engine did and the maximum amount of horsepower that it produced at peak times. They selected a particular course that they thought would, show the power of these bikes off at its best, good, fast roads, and they hired a professional performance rider to put each of these bikes through its paces. Now, the course chosen, I believe, if I remember correctly, was on the road. It wasn't a racetrack. So hopefully it didn't break the speed limits, but he was told to ride each of those bikes as fast as he possibly could to get the best times on those bikes. Now, don't forget, each of these bikes was a 100 horsepower bike, ranging from a lightweight sports bike to a big, lardy, fat sports tourer. I think it was something like a pan-European, but don't quote me on that. I'll see if I can find a link to it. And if I can, I'll leave it in the video description. Now, the results of this test were quite sobering. Don't forget, this was a professional performance rider, far better than the likes of me and you, and his instructions were to wring as much horsepower of each of those engines as he possibly could without breaking the law, or presumably without breaking the law. Now, the bike that he managed to extract most horsepower from, unsurprisingly, was the Pan-European, because it required more horsepower to move it, and it required more horsepower to overcome wind resistance. And the best he got out of it for a split second was 70 horsepower. And it didn't come top in the time trial. The rest of the bikes, though, were a bit of an eye-opener, because none of them managed to extract more than 50 horsepower. In fact, the majority were in the low 40s. So it doesn't matter how hard you ride or how good of a rider you believe you are, 50 brake horsepower is more than you will ever be able to use on the roads. And I would argue that 30 brake horsepower is as much as anyone realistically needs. 30 brake horsepower will get you up to 80 or 90 miles an hour. So all those Americans and Australians that think if they can't do 80 miles an hour, every motor vehicle on the road is going to squash them, they'll be safe with a 30 horsepower engine. And for the most part, they won't be using all the power that that engine is capable of producing. So, for all of you that have managed to get towards the end of this video and has maybe actually done a little bit of reading on top of that, or maybe you're just an experienced motorcyclist who, like me, knows that 40 or 50 horsepower is ample, and you see one of those YouTube videos asking, is 40 horsepower really enough? Well, yeah, you've already got your answer. You know it is. It's pointless watching such a video. You've just got an amateur that doesn't know their ass from their elbow trying to argue that 40 brake horsepower isn't enough, or perhaps even is enough for a motorcycle, in the mistaken belief that if they ride it as fast as they possibly can, they are using all the horsepower that that engine is capable of producing. And constantly redlining a demo bike is not an indication of how much horsepower is going to the back wheel, by the way. Right, so there you have it. 50 brake horsepower is more than enough for your average rider, even your expert rider for that matter. So just factor that into your purchasing decisions in the future, because excess horsepower just means a more empty bank account in every way, both in the purchasing of that machine and the running of it. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you would leave a like and subscribe to this channel if you're not already a subscriber. You can help me out in other ways via the super thanks button or via my Patreon page. Either of those is much appreciated. I will of course be back next week, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.